Welcome to our deep dive. Today, it's going to be Schopenhauer, and we're going deep, like really deep. This one's for the philosophers out there, the folks who already know the basics and want to get into the nitty-gritty.
Right, exactly. We're not going to spend a lot of time on Schopenhauer 101.
No, not at all.
We're going to jump right into some of the really intricate and often debated aspects of his thought.
Okay, so to kick things off, let's talk about one of his most foundational works, the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason.
Yes, the PSR.
Now, I know everyone listening is familiar with the principle of sufficient reason, the idea that everything must have a reason or an explanation. But Schopenhauer's take on it is anything but straightforward.
Oh, absolutely. He doesn't just accept the PSR at face value. He really dissects it. He analyzes its different forms and how it plays out in different areas of knowledge, from logic and math to science and metaphysics. And through that analysis, he exposes some pretty surprising limitations, especially when it comes to understanding the ultimate nature of reality.
It's almost like he's taking this principle, this idea that's so fundamental to how we make sense of the world, and he's kind of pulling it apart, showing its cracks.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. He's basically arguing that the PSR, while very useful for understanding the phenomenal world, the world of appearances, it ultimately fails to grasp the true nature of reality, the thing in itself.
It's a tool of the intellect, right?
Right.
Which is great for understanding relationships between things, but not the things themselves.
Right, exactly.
And this critique of the PSR, it's not just some abstract philosophical game he's playing. It has huge implications for how he approaches some of the big questions like, well, the existence of God, for instance.
Oh, absolutely. He uses his critique of the PSR to dismantle those traditional arguments for God's existence. The cosmological argument, the ontological argument. He sees them as attempts to, stretch the PSR beyond its limits, trying to apply it to a realm that's beyond the reach of reason.
So he's pushing back against those Enlightenment thinkers who believe that reason alone could reveal the truth about God and the universe.
Exactly. He's saying, hold on a minute. Reason's got its place, but it's not the be-all and end-all.
And this skepticism about the power of reason, it's a theme that runs through his entire philosophy. And it leads him to develop his own very unique metaphysical system.
Right, centered around the concepts of course, the will and representation.
The famous world as will and representation. Now, that's a big one. And it can be a little tricky to wrap your head around. It's not your typical mind-matter dualism, is it?
No, not at all. Schopenhauer is doing something much more radical here. He's saying that the world has these two fundamental aspects, but they're not separate substances like mind and matter. It's more like, think of a coin.
Okay, a coin.
Two sides,
Okay, try.
inseparable, right? Two ways of looking at the same underlying reality.
Got it. So how do we even begin to understand this concept of will? It's not just our everyday will, like when we decide to have another cup of coffee.
Right. No, it's much deeper than that. He describes will as this blind, striving force that permeates everything. It's the engine driving all of existence, from the simplest organisms to the most complex human behaviors. It's relentless, it's insatiable, it's constantly seeking satisfaction, but never truly finding it.
It sounds almost like this cosmic force, kind of like the Tao in Eastern philosophy, or maybe even Spinoza's concept of substance.
Yes, the comparisons are apt. Schopenhauer was deeply influenced by both Eastern and Western philosophy, and you can see how those influences come together in his concept of will.
But he also takes these ideas in a new direction, especially when he links them with his theory of knowledge.
Right, because it's not enough to just say that will exists. You have to explain how we can even know about it, given his skepticism towards the power of reason, and that's where representation comes in.
Okay, so representation is how we experience this will.
Exactly. The world as we perceive it, the world of objects, of events, even our own thoughts and feelings, all of this is representation. It's the world as it appears to us, shaped by our minds and our senses.
So we're not experiencing the will directly. We're experiencing its effects, its representations, almost like, those shadows on the cave wall in Plato's allegory.
Oh, perfect analogy. He's saying that what we see is like those shadows. We don't have direct access to the true forms, to the will itself.
And here's where his debt to Kant becomes really clear, right? This idea that our minds shape our experience, that there's this distinction between the phenomenal world, the world we perceive, and the noumenal world, the world of things in themselves.
Absolutely. He builds on Kant's transcendental idealism, but he takes it further. He argues that the thing in itself, the ultimate reality beyond our representations, is not some unknowable, abstract thing. It is will.
And that insight, that connection between the thing in itself and will,
Yeah.
that's the foundation for his rather, well, pessimistic view of the world, isn't it?
It is, because once you see the world as driven by this blind, insatiable will, this will that's always striving, never truly satisfied, well, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that suffering is kind of baked into the very fabric of existence.
It's not just that bad things happen. It's that this striving, this lack of inherent satisfaction, is just part of the deal.
Right, and that leads us into some pretty dark territory, but we'll explore that more in the next part of our deep dive. Welcome back. Where we left off, it was a bit heavy, maybe.
Yeah, well, it's Schopenhauer, right? Pessimism is kind of his thing.
Right, exactly. But I think it's important to understand, his pessimism. It's not just some arbitrary, gloomy outlook. It's deeply rooted in his whole metaphysical system.
Right. It all goes back to that idea of will as the driving force behind everything.
Exactly. And remember, he describes will as this constant striving, this insatiable wanting that can never really be satisfied.
So it's not just that bad stuff happens, like that's part of life, sure. But he's saying there's this deeper principle at play, this inherent lack of satisfaction that's built into existence itself.
That's it. And that constant striving, that wanting, it inevitably leads to conflict, to suffering. He uses some, well, pretty vivid images to illustrate this point.
Oh, yeah, I think it's a bulldog ant, right?
Yeah, the bulldog ant that keeps fighting even after being cut in half, driven by that blind, insatiable will.
Okay, but some people might say, well, that's just nature being brutal. That doesn't necessarily mean that human life is inherently about suffering. So how does Schopenhauer connect this cosmic pessimism to, our everyday experience?
He does it by showing how we as individuals, we're also manifestations of that will. All our desires, our wants, our never-ending pursuit of goals, that's all the will expressing itself through us.
So we're all like that bulldog ant in a way.
Yeah.
Driven by a force we can't control and that can't be satisfied.
Yeah, in a sense. We're trapped in this cycle of desire and dissatisfaction. We achieve something and then we immediately want something else. There's no real lasting contentment.
So that is pretty bleak. I mean, if suffering is just like baked into the cake of existence, does that mean life is pointless? Is there no way out?
Well, Schopenhauer is definitely not afraid to look into the abyss. But he's not a nihilist. He does offer some, I guess you could say, pathways to alleviate, even if not completely escape, the suffering.
Okay, so there's some glimmer of hope in all that Schopenhauerian gloom.
There is. He talks about 3 main ways to rise above the suffering of daily life: aesthetic contemplation, moral awareness, and then asceticism. And these might seem like pretty different paths, but they all share something in common, this idea of detaching from the individual will.
All right, let's break those down a bit, starting with aesthetic contemplation. So art can help us escape the suffering caused by that, insatiable will.
Yeah, he believed that through the experience of beauty, especially in art, we can kind of step outside of ourselves for a moment. Our desires, our anxieties, all that fades away. It's about losing yourself in contemplation.
So it's not just about pleasure, like, oh, I like this painting, or this song makes me feel good.
No, it's deeper than that. He sees it as a way to connect with something eternal, something unchanging, like those Platonic forms that exist beyond the world of appearances.
Interesting. So he's drawing on Plato here. Through beauty, we're not just appreciating something, we're accessing a different level of reality.
Exactly. And out of all the art forms, he puts music on a pedestal.
Why music?
He considers it the most direct expression of will itself.
Wait, so music, which is something created and enjoyed by humans, is also a representation of this, like, blind universal force. How does that work?
Well, he thought that music bypasses the intellect, the part of us that thinks in concepts and words, and speaks directly to the will. He saw deep connections between the way music works, with harmony and melody and rhythm, and the way the will operates.
So when we listen to music, we're not just having an emotional response, we're actually experiencing something fundamental about reality.
That's how he saw it. It's like a direct line to the will.
Okay, that's a pretty wild way to think about music. But let's move on to his next path, which is moral awareness. How does morality fit into all of this?
For Schopenhauer, morality isn't about following a set of rules. It comes from this deeper understanding of reality. Recognizing the interconnectedness of all beings. Because if everything is ultimately driven by will, then on a fundamental level, we're all connected. We're all part of the same thing.
So true morality is rooted in this metaphysical understanding of interconnectedness. It's not about duty or obligation,
Hmm.
but about recognizing our shared essence.
Exactly. And from that recognition comes compassion, a genuine concern for the well-being of others. And that compassion is what allows us to, at least to some extent, break free from that ego-driven cycle of desire and suffering.
It's almost like he's saying that true morality comes naturally once you see through the illusion of separateness, the illusion that fuels so much of our selfishness and conflict.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But Schopenhauer's last path to transcendence, asceticism, that one takes this rejection of the will even further.
Right, asceticism. That always seemed like the most extreme option, the one that requires the most self-denial. So what does Schopenhauer mean by asceticism exactly, and how does it lead to this liberation he's talking about?
Asceticism for him, it's about actively denying the will to live, giving up worldly desires and pleasures, ultimately detaching yourself from that whole cycle of striving and suffering. It's a path of, well, renunciation,
Yeah.
self-discipline. He was inspired by figures like St. Francis and Jesus. He saw them as embodying this ascetic ideal.
I mean, that sounds incredibly difficult. It seems to go against our natural instincts. Like, we're wired to survive, to seek pleasure. How can anyone deny the will to live, let alone why would they even want to?
It is a paradox, he admits that, but he argues that true lasting peace, true liberation, it can only be achieved by going beyond that individual will, even if it means giving up the things we normally think of as making us happy.
So it's about recognizing that those worldly pleasures, they're ultimately fleeting, and finding a deeper kind of satisfaction that's not tied to the will at all.
Right. And that brings us to one of the most interesting and maybe the most confusing parts of Schopenhauer's philosophy, this idea of a mystical state of consciousness, a state that seems to exist beyond the reach of the will.
Yeah, the mystical dimension. We've covered a lot, but that's the part that always leaves me with more questions than answers.
Mm.
If everything is driven by will, how can there be something beyond it? Isn't that a contradiction?
And that's the question we're going to tackle next.
All right, so we're back. And, diving into the deep end of Schopenhauer, we've been through the will, the representation, the whole pessimism thing. But now we're getting to this really mysterious part, the mystical side of his thought.
Yeah, it's kind of a head scratcher. I mean, here's a guy who's all about the reality of suffering, super skeptical of traditional religion, and yet he's also talking about this mystical state that supposedly transcends the very will, he says, is causing all our problems. It's a tough one, no doubt. And Schopenhauer himself admits that it's really hard to describe this mystical state. He uses this phrase, relative nothingness, which, well, it sounds cool, but it's not exactly clear what it means.
Yeah, like, thanks for clearing that up, Schopenhauer.
Yeah.
But I guess that vagueness is part of the point, right?
I think so. He's basically saying that this mystical experience, it's so different from our everyday way of thinking and talking that our usual categories just don't apply.
So we're talking about a whole different way of knowing, something that goes beyond logic and reason.
Exactly. He believed that the intellect, the part of us that thinks in concepts and words, it's a great tool for understanding the world around us, but it can only take us so far.
To really get to the heart of reality,
Mm-hmm.
to have this mystical experience, we need something else.
Right. We need intuition.
This reminds me of some Eastern philosophies, like Buddhism, that talk
Mhm.
about a kind of wisdom that comes from direct insight, not from thinking things through logically.
Absolutely. Schopenhauer was definitely influenced by Eastern thought, and his idea of intuition has a lot in common with those non-dualistic traditions. For him, intuition is this direct, non-conceptual grasp of reality. It's a way of knowing that goes beyond the usual subject-object split that shapes how we normally see the world.
Okay, I'm following you. But if this mystical state can only be experienced through intuition, how can Schopenhauer even talk about it? I mean, if it's beyond words and concepts, how can he give us any clues?
Well, he does it very carefully, using metaphors and analogies to try and point towards something that's basically indescribable. He talks about ecstasy, rapture, even union with God. But he always emphasizes that those are just approximations.
So you can't really put it into words, you have to experience it for yourself.
Right, exactly. It's not something you can think your way into.
All right, but how does this mystical state fit into his whole philosophical system? If everything is will, how can there be something that's not will?
It does seem like a contradiction, doesn't it? But the way he resolves this is by saying that will, well, it's a fundamental part of reality, it might not be the whole story. Remember the thing in itself. He's suggesting that the thing in itself could have other aspects, other dimensions that we just don't normally perceive because we're so focused on seeing everything as driven by will.
So our usual way of understanding reality, the world as will and representation, that's just one perspective. And through this mystical experience, we can tap into a deeper level of reality.
That's the idea. It's like shifting from seeing everything as separate, as these individuals all struggling against each other, to experiencing this profound sense of unity, oneness with the underlying reality.
This is sounding a lot like the concept of non-duality in Eastern thought, the idea that the separation between self and other is ultimately an illusion.
Yeah, the parallels are definitely there. And while Schopenhauer was critical of organized religion, he really connected with the mystical core of these traditions. Like he saw them as confirming what he had already figured out philosophically, that it's possible to transcend the limits of that individual will.
But if this mystical state is so liberating, if it's the key to true freedom from suffering, why isn't it available to everyone?
Schopenhauer believed that the path to mystical consciousness, it's not easy, and it's only open to a few. He calls them geniuses in a spiritual sense, people with this special capacity for detachment, for transcendence.
So it's not about being smart or talented in the usual sense. It's about a certain kind of inner disposition.
Right. It's about having this willingness to let go of the ego, of all those attachments to worldly things. He compares these people to deep-sea divers who can hold their breath for a really long time, exploring these depths that most people can't even reach.
I like that image. It suggests that maybe we all have the potential for this mystical experience within us, but it takes a huge shift in perspective, a willingness to let go of how we normally see things.
Exactly. And this idea of letting go, of detaching from the individual will, it connects back to those other paths we were talking about. The aesthetic contemplation, the moral awareness, even the asceticism. They all point towards this fundamental change in consciousness.
And this is where Schopenhauer, even though he starts off sounding so pessimistic, gets surprisingly hopeful. He's saying that even in a world driven by this blind will, there's still a possibility of liberation, of finding this deeper peace, this sense of unity.
It's a strange kind of hope, a hope that comes from facing the reality of suffering head on, from really understanding where it comes from.
It's a philosophy that definitely asks a lot of us, but it offers a lot too. It's an invitation to go on this journey of self-discovery, to question everything, to confront our limits, and to seek out those moments of transcendence that can show us a different way of living.
Absolutely. And maybe that's the real value of Schopenhauer. He might not give us easy answers, but he asks the tough questions, the questions that make us grapple with what it means to be human and to search for those deeper truths that lie beyond the surface.
But this has been quite a trip, exploring the twists and turns of Schopenhauer's thought. He's definitely a philosopher who keeps us thinking, even centuries later. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one last question to ponder. If Schopenhauer's right, and suffering is just part of the human condition, does that mean all our efforts to make the world a better place are pointless? Or does understanding the nature of suffering, like he suggests, actually open up new possibilities for ethical action?
It's a good question, and one that connects these big philosophical ideas to the very real challenges we face in the world.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Arthur Schopenhauer. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking those flashes of insight that can help us lead richer, more meaningful lives.